I've never been the type to take vacations. Between my workload and my dislike of flying, I kept putting it off. But when our department finally hired someone competent to share the burden, my boss practically forced me to take some time off. I started wondering what I could do for 2 weeks without getting on a plane or hitting a ski slope. That's when I stumbled on an online ad for a gorgeous log cabin in the middle of a quiet, snow-covered forest. I couldn't believe how affordable it was. Massive living room, big fireplace, and plenty of space to curl up and read. It was near a ski resort, but apparently not part of it. The ad mentioned a single-lane forest road, so I figured it'd be private. Maybe too private. But after 2 years of no time off, I said to myself, why not? The drive wasn't bad, just a lonely stretch of road where I expected to see deer, or at least a couple of birds. Didn't spot a thing. No footprints, no cars, no movement in the trees. Finally, I arrived at the cabin, and let me tell you, the pictures didn't do it justice. Snow had been shoveled off the steps recently, though I didn't see any sign of who might have done it. Still, it made getting my bags inside a little safer. Once inside, the first thing I noticed was how cold it felt. I cranked up the heat, made a fire, and checked the kitchen. Turns out it was already stocked with food and a polite little note saying I could help myself. Too good to be true? Maybe. But after a grueling couple of years at work, I was ready to collapse. I threw some extra logs on the fire, sank into the couch, and fell asleep under a pile of blankets. I must have slept longer than intended because I woke up in the middle of the night, freezing and starving. The fire had died down. As I got up to revive it, I heard a loud knock at the front door. It startled me awake in seconds. I stood there rubbing my arms to keep warm, suddenly uneasy. It seemed crazy for someone to be out here at this hour, but they knocked again. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded shaky. A woman answered, sounding strangely upbeat. "Hi, I'm lost. Is there a town nearby?" She didn't sound outright threatening, but out here in the dark, my paranoia was in overdrive. There's one down the main road," I replied, gripping the iron fire poker just in case. "I see your tire tracks," she said. "Could I follow them? Are you trying to leave too?" Her words gave me the creeps. Something about her tone felt off. As I hesitated, I saw movement at a window in the living room. Some pale shape, almost like a face pressed up against the glass. It had dark, sunken eyes and a twisted black smile that was all wrong. My heart dropped. I looked away for half a second, and when I looked back, it was gone. But then the banging at the door grew louder. I scrambled for my phone, but it refused to turn on or charge. I locked every door, then ran around closing wooden shutters I found neatly hidden beside the windows. Oddly enough, each shutter clamped in place like a mini barricade. In those brief moments before I slammed each shutter shut, I saw more of those pale faces lurking in the trees. They were impossibly still, almost blending into the snow. By the time all the windows were covered, the knocking faded to nothing. No footsteps retreated. No voices, just silence. That silence didn't last long. By the next day, if it even was day, I felt feverish and weak. Everything in the cabin seemed colder, like the place itself was draining the warmth out of me. With no working phone, and no way to see outside without lifting a shutter, I huddled by the fireplace, forcing down snacks to keep up my energy. My eyes kept drifting shut, no matter how hard I fought it. When I woke again, I had no idea how much time had passed. My head pounded. My throat felt raw, and each breath came out a shaky rasp. Then came the voice again. Just a soft knock, and the same woman sounding weirdly concerned. "You okay in there?" she asked. "You need to get out of that cabin." Every hair on my neck stood up. "What are you talking about?" I croaked, hugging a blanket around me. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she said, "Please, just trust me. Let me help you. That place is making you sick." A sudden, stupid part of me wanted to believe her, if only because I felt so awful. I tried peeking outside, cracking a shutter just a bit. Sunlight, or maybe moonlight, glared off the snow. My eyes watered, adjusting to the brightness. At first, I saw nothing. Then figures emerged from between the trees, twisted forms that looked half human, half animal, with huge, unhinged mouths smeared in dark stains. They dragged what looked like animal carcasses behind them as they shuffled toward the cabin. My blood ran cold. I slammed the shutter shut, heart hammering. By the next time I awoke, the cabin had grown smoky and even colder. I smelled something burning, but I hadn't touched the fire in ages. Panicked, I lurched to my feet. Smoke seeped from behind the shutters. My eyes burned, and I coughed hard. The walls groaned in a way that sounded almost alive. Then I heard a crash in the kitchen. I stumbled toward it and found the back door had been battered open. The red-haired woman from outside stood there with a hammer in hand, coughing in the smoke. "Come on," she shouted. "You'll die in here." I wanted to follow her out, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Against my will, I grabbed a kitchen knife and slashed at her, slicing her left eye. I was horrified at what I was doing, but helpless to stop. She let out a pained cry, blood running down her cheek. In one swift motion, she swung the hammer, catching me in the temple. Next thing I knew, I was in my car, half frozen, watching the cabin go up in flames. A horrifying scream, like no sound I'd ever heard, poured out of the collapsing walls, followed by a burst of dark smoke that shot off into the trees. The red-haired woman was there, wrapping her coat around me. She helped me drink some water, ignoring the blood on her own face. "You'll be okay," she said gently, wincing at her eye wound. "You just need some medical attention. The cops are on their way." I tried to ask her name, to thank her, but I only managed an apologetic croak. She smiled and said, "I'll be fine, and you'll be fine too," then disappeared into the woods before the authorities arrived. In the hospital, the police questioned me. They didn't find any record of a booking or any road leading to a cabin, and yet there was a burnt-out structure in the forest, unregistered, belonging to no one. A strange story with no logical explanation. I've heard rumors of hikers going missing in that same area, or being found in mysterious ruins. Too frightened or delirious to speak. People keep saying I was lucky, and I agree. I was. Whatever evil was in that cabin nearly claimed me, and I have no clue how or why it exists. Maybe there are some corners of the world that just aren't meant for humans. All I know is there's darkness out there, beyond reason, and sometimes a bit of unexpected light. In my case, it was a red-haired stranger with a hammer and nerves of steel. I hope, if you ever find yourself face to face with something like that, you'll have someone equally brave watching your back. Let me start by saying I've booked lots of Airbnb cabins in my life, and this little getaway near Forks, Washington, didn't seem that different at first. I wanted a rustic camping experience, so when I saw a listing for a cabin that basically amounted to a tough shed in the woods, I was all for it. The place had no running water, no electricity, no cooling, Just coordinates and a promise of solitude. Perfect, right? So I booked it. The host's name was Janet, and her profile photo showed a nice-looking, slender, middle-aged woman with graying hair. I got the automatic booking confirmed message, which wasn't unusual. But when I tried messaging her on the app, she took a while to respond. No big deal. Hosts can be busy after all. Eventually, Janet replied with a brief message. Sorry for the delay, I was out. There's no phone service or Wi-Fi at the cabin, so I'll send you directions. Enjoy the isolation. Great, I wrote back. We're looking forward to it. We're all set with gear, just need the directions. We? She asked, which threw me off. I reminded her it would be me and my husband. She seemed cool with it, just a little surprised. Maybe she forgot I mentioned him. Again, not a huge deal. The day we set out, we stopped in a small store just outside Forks. Our bright blue Prius stood out among the pickups, and the man at the counter asked what brought us out that way. We're heading to a little off-grid cabin, I said, excited. He looked unnerved. Oh, you mean the one way out there? There was a hint of worry in his eyes. You know, there are other cabins in town with electricity, running water. I laughed lightly. Thanks, but we're ready for roughing it. Marshmallows are packed and everything. Right, he said quietly. Well, good luck. I'll admit, that should have been my first red flag. He looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. Still, we finished shopping and drove on. The last 30 miles took us down a dirt road surrounded by towering evergreens. My phone signal vanished, just as Janet had warned. No problem. I had downloaded the directions. After driving a couple of miles through some truly dense forest, we spotted the cabin. Really, it was just an old tough shed with enough space to pitch a medium-sized tent inside. There was a simple fire pit nearby, and the trees were so thick, the sunlight came in patches. It was about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and apart from the unnerving silence, everything looked gorgeous. We pitched our tent inside the shed, got our gear organized, and by twilight, we were roasting marshmallows over the fire. It grew eerily still once the sun started going down. No animal sounds, no wind rustling in the leaves. It was just complete silence, like we were in one of those soundproof rooms you hear about. It got under my skin a bit, but we tried to shrug it off as part of the adventure. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the quiet was so absolute, you'd think the whole forest was holding its breath. I remember whispering to my husband, "This is the weirdest silence I've ever heard," and he agreed. We decided to go to sleep and maybe leave a bit earlier than planned in the morning if the weird vibes persisted. I'm not sure how long I slept. 2 hours, tops, when I woke to a strange noise. It sounded like a child screaming into a broken microphone. It echoed in a way that didn't sound entirely human. I reached out, only to realize my husband wasn't next to me. My heart instantly started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and one of our small handguns, we always bring protection when we camp, and called his name into the dark. The forest absorbed my voice, making it sound small. Then I heard the scream again, and a second later I heard him call my name, but it was so faint. It came from deeper in the woods. Panicked, I followed the sound. I had no clue what I'd find out there. An animal attack? A terrible fall? The worst thoughts swirled in my mind. Eventually, I spotted him sitting on a fallen log. He was breathing heavily, his head in his hands, and there was blood on his shoes and fingers. My stomach lurched at the sight. I whispered, "Oh my God, are you hurt?" But he just sat in silence. After what felt like ages, he slowly turned toward me. His eyes were wild, like someone possessed. They had this feral, hungry glint I'd never seen before. His face was contorted with, I don't know, madness? It definitely wasn't the man I knew. When he lurched toward me, I freaked. I stumbled back, dropped the flashlight, then scrambled to grab it off the ground. Somehow I managed to turn around and run, tears streaming down my face. Sure, he was chasing me. But the forest was pitch dark, and adrenaline was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. Miraculously, I found my way back to the shed. There, I realized I'd gashed my arm on a branch. Blood was running down my arm, but it wasn't an arterial gush, so I wrapped it fast with gauze. Then I heard that same eerie, mechanical wail somewhere off in the trees. My heart felt like it was about to pound right out of my chest. Suddenly, I saw my husband again, but this time he looked different. No wild eyes, just pure exhaustion. His face was pale, and he was shaking. The blood was still on him, but he seemed more confused than anything. He mumbled, I don't feel right. I can't," and then just collapsed. Despite my terror, my love for him took over. I helped him to his feet, half dragging him toward our car. That's when we heard it once more, a shrieking, warbling cry that made my husband's eyes go wide with fear. He started hyperventilating, and I nearly lost it right then. But I forced myself to keep calm, telling him to focus on me. We piled into our Prius, leaving every bit of gear behind. I slammed the door and stomped on the gas, desperate to follow the path back to the main road. I realized we'd passed an old metal gate on the way in. Now it was open. As we tore past it, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A tall, thin shape, like some emaciated figure with skin stretched over bone. Its face was featureless, just a ghastly mouth lined with cracked lips. One more scream split the night, and then it vanished. I didn't stop driving until we reached a brighter stretch of road, where I finally had phone signal again. My husband was semi-conscious, mumbling about not remembering anything after falling asleep. I wanted to take him straight to a hospital, but he insisted he was okay, just shaken. Maybe we should have gone, but we ended up continuing home in shocked silence. To this day, I have no explanation for what we encountered. Part of me wonders if that thing we saw was real, or if the quiet and the darkness played tricks on our minds. But the blood on my husband's clothes, that was all too real. I shared this story because I still can't wrap my head around it. One thing's for sure. If you ever rent a cabin with no address out in the middle of nowhere, maybe think twice before you go. That lonely silence has a way of getting under your skin, and you might not be prepared for what's waiting out there. I live on the top floor of a 3-unit townhouse. 2 apartments up, 1 down. The other upstairs unit is an Airbnb my landlord rents out to people coming in for music festivals. Most of the time, I don't mind. Sure, weekend guests can be loud, but I'll take that over long-term noisy neighbors any day. Though honestly, I feel sorry for the girl who lives below me. She's always out walking her little dog at 6 in the morning, rain or shine, before work. She doesn't get much rest with people partying upstairs on the weekends. Not many guests come during the week, so it's typically pretty quiet. This week, though, I noticed a couple pull into the parking lot Sunday evening. They were the strangest guests, mostly because I can't recall many details about them, like I'm missing pieces of the puzzle. I was out on my balcony, casually birdwatching with my binoculars. I know it's a weird hobby, but my mom got me into it when I was little. I had a clear view of them unloading their suitcases from a dark sedan with tinted windows. It was around 7 p.m., but even in that good light, all I can remember is the guy was somewhere between 5'10" and 6'2", with dark, maybe brown, maybe black, hair, wearing a white t-shirt and blue jeans. He could have been 25 or 40. He just had one of those faces. The woman was just as vague. Maybe blondish brown hair, average build, wearing a dress that might have been gray or blue. Same ageless thing going on. They were definitely white, but that's about all the certainty I have. They were whispering as they walked by the side of the building, and the woman occasionally laughed, a strange, shrill giggle that set me on edge more than it should have. Over the next 2 days, I only ran into them once or twice. They never said much. The guy tipped the brim of his baseball cap and said hello once. I remember thinking how that cap made him look like a spy or an undercover superhero from a movie. On their second day, I bumped into the downstairs neighbor. I asked what she thought of the new guests, since I assumed she'd hear them. She furrowed her brows and admitted she was surprised by how silent they'd been. She knows I move around a lot at night. I'm a bit of a night owl, and usually she can hear some footsteps overhead. But with those two, it was as if they weren't there at all. Maybe they were off exploring our city 24/7. She still looked troubled, though, like she couldn't quite put her finger on something that bothered her. I'd only lived in this place for a couple of months, but the downstairs neighbor had been there longer, long enough to get used to the typical Airbnb comings and goings. She's always struck me as a bit anxious, maybe introverted, but we'd shared some small talk in the past. At least she always makes sure the doors are locked at night, which I appreciate. That evening, I went out with friends for a few beers. By the time I got back, it was late. The weather had been warming up, and since our landlord never seems to turn on the air conditioning early enough, my apartment was stuffy when I returned. I opened my balcony door to let in a breeze, cracked open another beer, and settled into my chair outside. It must have been around 2:30 in the morning, and in my slightly buzzed, sleepy state, I drifted off. A giggle jolted me awake, and I froze. I heard hushed voices right beneath my balcony. The second I realized it was the couple, I felt that weird tension in my stomach again. Why were they whispering below my neighbor's window at 2:30 a.m.? I didn't dare call out. Something about their voices made me want to stay hidden. I carefully shifted to see if I could catch a glimpse of them. Our balconies are made of thick wooden slats, and if I crouched just right, I had a partial view into the space below. I couldn't see them directly, but in the reflection of the house next door's window, I caught their silhouettes. I grabbed my binoculars, heart hammering away as I tried to see them without giving myself away. Their eyes, even through the reflection, glowed faintly in the dark. The man was chanting something quietly in a language I couldn't recognize. Maybe not a language at all, more like an incantation. It was repetitive, droning, unsettling. They both stared straight into my neighbor's window, and after a moment, the man reached out and tried to open it. It must have been locked, because it wouldn't budge. I should have called the police then and there, but I was tired, tipsy, and, to be honest, terrified. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I watched him push harder on the window. Suddenly, he laughed in a weird, theatrical voice, saying, "Clever girl," in a fake accent, like referencing a movie. The woman sighed in disappointment, and the man turned to her with a smirk. Then he produced a small knife from his back pocket or waistband. My mind started racing. Oh my God, I thought. They're going to break in. But instead, he took the woman's arm, lifted the knife, and cut a long gash from the inside of her elbow to her wrist. It was so fluid, no hesitation. I sucked in a breath to keep from gasping and giving myself away. The blood looked black in the low light, pouring quickly down her arm. She didn't even flinch, just placed her other hand on the wound and used the dripping blood to draw a symbol on the glass. Everything about it was wrong. The calmness, the hush in their voices, the bizarre glow of their eyes. Once the symbol was complete, they both placed a palm on the window. The woman's voice rang out, strangely resonant in the quiet night. "And as you have protected yourself against us, you will not be taken this night." They paused. Then she added, "But we'll be back." They grinned, teeth almost luminous. I felt goosebumps shoot down my arms. A second later, they turned around as if they hadn't done anything unusual. With the same collected manner, they walked to their sedan, got in, and drove off. I lay there on the balcony for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Finally, I crept back inside, locked my own windows and doors, and tried to calm my shaking hands. The next morning, I woke up convinced, hoping, really, that I'd dreamt the whole thing. Even drunk, it had felt too vivid. I darted downstairs the moment I mustered enough courage, but there was nothing on the window. No blood, no symbol, no sign anyone had been there. My neighbor looked completely normal as she took her dog out for its morning walk, though she did glance around warily, like she'd sensed something off in the night. I couldn't exactly ask, "So, did you happen to hear people chanting and drawing symbols in blood on your window without sounding nuts?" Since then, I've been checking the parking lot constantly for any sign of that dark sedan. I don't know if it was a threat, a twisted prank, or something more supernatural. All I know is I've never seen them again, and yet I can't shake the feeling they could show up at any moment. Any random night, ready to pick up where they left off. I told a couple of close friends about it. One suggested maybe I call the landlord or the police, but what could I say? Some weird couple that I can't describe was drawing blood symbols on my neighbor's window at 2:30 a.m. Please investigate. There's no trace they were even here, so I've stayed quiet and hyper-vigilant, scanning the lot each day for a dark car, half expecting glowing eyes to look back up at me. It's been a few nights now. No sightings, nothing unusual. But sometimes, in the hush of early morning, I think I hear that shrill giggle echo in the back of my mind. And I wonder, did my neighbor protect herself somehow? From what? And for how long? Because the couple was clear in their warning. They'll be back. And I can't help but think, next time maybe they'll come for me.